start simple, but more than that, probably one layer deeper is focus on your why. What drives you? What motivates you? Because ultimately, I think if you are successful, ultimately accomplish success, it'll be because you've didn't consider it work and you enjoy the endeavor as well as the process. I think regardless of how much I worked, how trying and taxing it was, I think I still enjoyed a lot of it, right? So, I mean, don't get me wrong. Sometimes it's a pain in the butt to wake up and being tired sucks. But in the long run, if you do what you really appreciate and enjoy and what really drives you and motivates you, it is much, much easier to do.
Welcome to The Wild Show with your hosts, Will Chang, Lee Chang, and Andrew Su. Hi, this is Will Chang, and as always, I have my co-hosts Lee Chang and Andrew Su with me.
Hey guys.
Hey, good to be here.
Today, our guest is our friend Kent Wu. Kent is a serial entrepreneur that has founded and exited multiple businesses, including Air Splat, the largest retailer of shooting sports equipment, gear, and tactical accessories. Air Splat was acquired by a vertical integrator in 2016. And Milk and Eggs, a digital platform providing consumers with higher quality, fresher, perishable goods at lower prices and greater convenience. Milk and Eggs was acquired by GrubHub in 2019. After selling Milk and Eggs, Kent went to Taiwan to become the chief operating officer and board director for JustKitchen, the leading virtual kitchen operator in Taiwan, creating and curating delivery-only food brands and cuisines on the internet. With more than 40 locations in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Philippines, and Malaysia, JustKitchen had its IPO in 2021. Today, Kent sits on the boards of half a dozen businesses in Taiwan. Finally, Kent is a physical specimen and has done a lot of work on his own fitness journey and has depth and knowledge on how to gain muscle for men over 40. So we're going to dig into that today. Welcome, Kent.
Wonderful. Great to be here, guys.
So when I look at all the business success that you've been a part of, it's very obvious that you build your entrepreneurial skill set over time. And each new venture builds on top of the previous success and learnings. Air Splat took 15 years, while Milk and Eggs took you 4. You started Air Splat in 2001 after only working at AOL for a couple of years right after college, very early in your career. How did you learn about entrepreneurship at such a young age?
Thanks for asking that, Will. I always call myself an accidental entrepreneur. I don't think I had ambitions necessarily to come out and carve my own path. In 2001, I had graduated, was working at AOL, which is America Online. For any of your listeners who aren't familiar with AOL, it was the Google of the Web 1.0 era. So was at AOL for a short time, and then the dot-com bubble, which was in 2001, came. I was actually on contract, so stayed on for a little bit longer. But I gave myself a goal if I could not find a new job or a new position within 6 months, that I would just create my own, really, because I had nothing to lose.
Can you tell us about how you found the opportunity of Air Splat and what excited you about building this business?
Sure. I think at the time, I was looking at different sorts of paths forward. I studied 20-something years ago, studied cognitive science. That it's interdisciplinary study between psychology, neuroscience, and computer science. The use cases for that are usually either user interface or AI. And then when I was at AOL, I was doing UI interface design. Prior to getting laid off, before the riff they had a riff and I wasn't included in it, at least initially. So I was looking at different opportunities. And I think I had a friend who recommended this new thing called paintball airsoft. And I was always looking at it from a vantage point of business as opposed to kind of pure entertainment. So I came across it, thought it was a pretty cool sport, I guess. And along with that, I felt e-commerce at the time, 2001, this is eBay and Yahoo, again, Web 1.0. I felt like e-commerce would be a great way to distribute and kind of go to market with this product.
Can you describe what the internet was like at that time? And then how do you even start sourcing and manufacturing and building that brand?
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I guess we're still in the midst of potentially Web 3.5, I guess. That's normally what I would call it because 3.0 was
2.5.
crypto. Is it 2.5?
Oh, you mean we're beyond crypto or we're
Yeah,
still kind of
I know.
in between?
I feel like AI is its own, and I think it's too early to tell if it builds on top of blockchain or not. But in any case, at the time it was interesting, right? So largest players, AOL, Yahoo, very different. I think Google was created in, 98, 97, somewhere around then. So in '01, Google was barely being used, not a large amount of penetration. It was a very different landscape, definitely. At the time, even Amazon was, gosh, I don't even know, a hundredth of what it is now. But I felt, at least as a strategy, our product was unique enough. There's always some sort of differentiator when we go to market or when I try to launch or enter a market. So for Air Splat in specific, I felt the products were unique enough that you couldn't buy it normally in your brick and mortar stores. So you were kind of forced to go online. And at the time, online e-commerce, again, was relatively new, very different kind of both reach model and kind of just like ecosystem. I can go into later on our differentiators every time we go to market, but definitely I think every time, especially for e-commerce, when you enter a market, to have a distinct differentiator, not only between your product selection, but also your go-to-market strategy.
What was your differentiator?
For us, for Air Splat, it was mainly the product and the fact that we sold online. There weren't many people online. Initially, when we started in 01, it was probably only two or three players. So it was very early, both in e-commerce as well as in our industry. Over the 15 years, you build on top of that. I think back then, you receive an order, you can take a week to ship your order, and customers are pretty okay with that. By the time we exited in 2015, we were doing guaranteed 2-day shipping. So it would guarantee to ship in 2 days. So we wouldn't sit on the order. So landscape definitely, and I think customer expectation definitely changes and evolves as the industry grows and develops.
So I mean, 15 years, by the time you end up selling it, you must have been built like a really healthy organization. But I'd imagine that when you first started it, you were doing everything on your own, right?
Yes, great question. Yeah, so initially I can paint the picture, I think 22 years old, kind of first bootstrap, self-funded business, had an office that was about 200 square feet. It was just me, myself. I remember I had multiple phone lines and multiple email addresses, which I was all answering and doing myself. But I would tell the customer to forward from info to support back in the day when people were using email to contact a company. And same as when I answer the phone call, I would tell them to email the support department so that it could be handled. But no, I remember for the first 2 years, it was quite an experience. I think it was amazing in the fact that it was very trying. It was definitely a lot of effort. I remember I would start my day around like 9 or 10 a.m., go until about midnight, maybe even 1 a.m., and then go home, sleep for a handful of hours, and then start that over again. And it was 7 days a week. And that's what it was like for the first essentially 2 years. But it was amazing. There was several milestones along the way. I remember filing taxes, I think the second or third year. So it was very fast, right? Within the first year, second year, I remember. So the third year, which was actually taxes for the previous year, right? For the second year, I think immediately I told my CPA, I was like, there's too many zeros on here. And I don't have this much money to pay this many taxes. Like, I don't know how this works. How do I owe close to $1 million in taxes and I have zero cash in my bank account or close to zero? And the CPAs give your standard. And I think anyone that has been through this, CPAs always give a very standard response, which is congratulations, you've done very well. Same thing for the lawyers, right? When you get sued, the lawyers say, congratulations, you're big enough to be sued now. I think it was a rocket ship of a ride. By the time we exited in 2015, I felt like it was a very stable, we were at a very steady state and a very stable state. We had 3 warehouses on the West Coast, a few 100,000 square feet in warehouse space, and a few hundred, just over 300 people in staff. So I felt like it was a good medium-sized business. I felt for the industry, we were at a very stable place. We were definitely one of the market leaders.
Ken, I'm curious, was this the first, I guess, business that you started? Like, were you entrepreneurial even like in high school, or were you selling lemonade on the corner like as a little kid or something? Or this is the first time that you delve into business?
This is the first time I've done my own business. I think for at least me, sales, when you sell lemonade or sell cookies or whatever the case may be, I did have a summer gig where I sold some knives. I think it was the 2 or 3
Cocoa?
summers. Yeah, Cocoa. Correct.
Oh, man.
So I did the Cocoa thing. I actually did relatively well. I think we sold 300,000 in knives. So did okay. And it was like 4 months, right? So I think it was about 350,000 in knives in one summer. So I think that was a fun summer. It was great. But I think at least in my mind, there's so much more to running a business than just sales. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's very important. Top of funnel and sales funnel is important, and lead generation and all of that is great. But business operation, management, culture is such large pieces of the puzzle, and they're so significant to a successful enterprise.
There's a lot of questions I have, but the first one, I just want to go into the Cutco thing, because I think door-to-door sales is like the hardest job in the world, right? And being able to actually go door-to-door and sell $350,000 of knives is incredible. And so I was wondering, how did you do it? Like, what was your process like? How did you get over the fear of rejection?
Oh, rejection. I can go to later on rejection. I felt like knives was relatively, at least in that sort of kind of, I don't want to say knives in specific, but just in my experience, it was knives. But generally sales, I think rejection is part of the game. But in fundraising, and later on we can get into fundraising, definitely is, I think, risk factor. And on the rejection level is actually much, much, what's the word I'm looking for? Not just
More
exciting, but
devastating or?
yeah, more catastrophic, right? Because if you don't raise a fund, your business is kind of dead in the water, right? Whereas in sales, at least at that age, you only have plus side. And the only downside is just rejection, right? A little bit of hurt ego. They had a great process. I ran through the process. It's important to keep even within the fact that it's only sales driven and sales focused, focusing on your inputs, right? Your metrics and doing what you're supposed to be doing. Later on, I think, your KPIs, right? I think later on when you start running organizations, your OKRs or your objectives are more important are also a follow-up to your KPIs and kind of your key indicators. Yeah. But no, rejection was, you get a little butthurt at first, the first couple of times, but you very quickly adjust and realize this is just part of the game, right? And it's totally normal.
It'll be interesting to see how many of our listeners are going to remember or know what Cutco is,
Yeah.
along with AOL. I mean, I think we have some Gen Z audience members, but Cutco was big back then. That was one of the few kind of available summer opportunities for high school kids, especially going to college and whatnot. And I will say people that I know that did well in Cutco all ended up doing very well later in their careers. I feel like it's a good indicator.
Good one. Yeah. I think it's interesting. It's because it's very self-motivated and self-driven. They set goals for you and they teach you how, but they won't do it for you. So ultimately that is really could be an indicator of grit or resilience or just your ability to just kind of pound on the pavement.
Yeah. I mean, I think for some people, it's all self-motivated, right? It's like, oh, this could be interesting. I make a few bucks. But I think if you are competitive and you have that drive, it's like, oh, how can I maximize my sales, right? And it's really coming from within. So going back to the airsoft company, you mentioned, Kent, that when you were first told about like this opportunity or this sector, you looked at it immediately through a business lens. So were you actually a airsoft fanatic? Were you actually interested? Or was it completely just, oh, there's an opportunity to sell these things online and that's why I'm going to start looking into it?
Yeah, I was always a believer of you never deal with your own inventory. So I intentionally stayed, I guess, arm's distance away from the sport itself. I would probably play a couple of times a year at most. And just to clarify, it started off with airsoft and paintball. By the time we had exited, it was kind of multi-vertical. We were really doing, and I think, I think I skipped over this question earlier, but our supply chain, so the engine we had created was really just a distribution engine. We were kind of like an Amazon for our verticals. So we would find specific verticals where the supply chain, either on the supply side or target audience, so that the consumer side were actually similar or had overlap. Although we started with airsoft and even to the end, airsoft and paintball, we were still doing airsoft and paintball. Really, we were coupling on different verticals to expand our pie and grow our kind of target audience. So we started off with airsoft paintball. We went on to optics, so like scopes and shooting kind of optics, both with non-magnifying and magnifying. And these were for real firearms as well as for airsoft guns or paintball guns as well. Then we went on to peripheral accessories. So we were a GSI certified vendor, meaning we were certified by the government to be a vendor to sell to the government. So we sold to police departments, National Guard, FBI, CIA. So a lot of the government agencies as well. It wasn't a huge amount. It was probably only about 25% of our business. So about a quarter of our business. Their orders are not kind of as recurring, but it's very unique, right? Their product set, they're looking for scopes. They're looking for training equipment. They're looking for some lower end entry level vests and apparel, which from an airsoft player's perspective, it's actually pretty high, medium high end. But for a law enforcement official, it's a pretty entry level kind of good gear to practice with, but not to kind of go out on the field with. We had what you call plate chest carriers, which are essentially bulletproof vests, but instead of a ceramic plate, instead of some of the special ballistics fabric, it would be nylon plus a plastic plate, right? So it would kind of emulate the feel and the sensation, and they could train with it at a much affordable price point. And then later on, we even got into camping equipment and also cycling. So that was our, not just business model, but later on, I don't want to say differentiator, but our go-to-market to expand is to continually bolt on these additional revenue streams and additional markets. And each one of these had its own website and technically consumer-facing side, right? So we looked very focused on kind of the individual niche or sport we were trying to distribute.
You weren't a manufacturer for any of the verticals, right?
No. So our big, I don't want to say big, but our main emphasis was kind of this D2C before D2C was around. So we would source directly from the manufacturer. Most of it was in Asia, whether it be Taiwan, China, or Japan. And we would source, and these manufacturing centers or hubs, you could find kind of very peripheral manufacturers because all the supply source, raw materials for these manufacturers, upstream vendors are actually all similar. So, for example, toys would all be manufactured in this one huge province. Sporting goods would then be in the neighboring province, and they would all be there too. So we would source directly from the manufacturer, bring in our own container. Again, this supply chain and this kind of this engine that we had built, we had containers getting loaded all the time. We would mix containers. There's some commodities that ship better in a container and they're very voluminous. Weight-wise, you don't reach the capacity of a container, but space-wise, you reach the capacity. So then we would mix and match, get kind of optimal logistics to lower our costs and freight costs so that we could bring them in, get them into our warehouses. And the reason why we had 3 warehouses all on the West Coast was because of logistics and the ports. So we'd bring them all in, get them in, ship them out. What was kind of the model on the engine.
Yeah, you were kind of continuously optimizing the entire engine as you were expanding the parts and then I guess powering more and more things. I actually want to go all the way back to your first launch though. So your first bet, did you already validate and you were testing the kind of e-commerce approach before making the order? How big was that bet, if you can remember? And kind of what was going through your mind as you were making that first purchase?
Sorry, just to clarify, when you say bet, you mean your first venture into business venture?
Yeah, your first venture into it. No, into the company. So let's say the first was airsoft guns, right? So I had assumed you had to make an initial purchase to then sell it. I actually want to hear, right? You got the conviction, right? And you knew that your edge was going to be e-com. And so how did you kind of prove it out to convince yourself to make that bet? And then would love to hear the story just of setting it up and then making the order and what that was like.
Sure. Initially, the process is we found one local distributor, which we've made our first purchase from. There's a little bit of a kind of bet or kind of gamble where you buy some inventory and you sit on it. Really, I think product SKU wise, there was probably only about, we purchased probably about 20 or 30 maybe, but listed on the website at the time was about 180. Close to 200. So there's a gap between that. And the rest of that is what I did at the time was just in time. So after we received an order for it, then I would go buy it. And I really tried to focus, and this is all trial and error, but I think inventory management as a whole, I think an ongoing kind of focus for any inventory-based businesses. But yeah, so try to focus on the actual on-hand inventory to about 80% of what we would hopefully sell. It's an 80-20 rule, right? So you put 80% of your inventory on 20% that actually sell, right? Because those are the high volume movers. And then 80%, those are the long tail products that don't move as much. And then hopefully you have 20% of your actual inventory costs or assets in that great majority. And that's unfortunately was kind of how, specifically for airsoft at least, this product SKU distribution worked out. I think for different sports and different industries, it's different. For camping and then cycling, it was kind of the other way around actually. 80% of your inventory was on 80% of your product. So there was about 80% that sold really well. Whereas for airsoft, it was actually only 20% just because the high volume movers were just high volume movers.
So, I mean, from 2001 to 2016, you spent 15 years really building this business, going from just you as a single person to operating probably a really large organization, really structured organization. I believe you bootstrapped it, so I don't think you've took on outside investors. And you guys probably were generating a pretty good revenue, right? Why did you decide to sell your company?
Great question. So at the time, around 2012, actually already, so about 10 years later, we were still growing and we were still doing well. Company was really at a state where it was very stable and it was a steady state growth. I think we had coupled on at that point probably 3 or 4 different verticals. And I was starting to look at other opportunities. I was phasing myself out slowly, kind of one hand on and one hand off with my partner who I was phasing into the operations, was mostly taking over day-to-day hiring, firing. And really, I was only left with business development, some legal matters, and also kind of business strategy. And I did that for about 3 or 4 years. So the company was actually very stable, essentially medium-sized enterprise. So I think for me, I love the 0 to 1 and maybe the 1 to 5-ish It's very exciting. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of growth. And that's what really gets me going. And we got to kind of 3 locations with several hundred people. The pace felt a little bit different and it wasn't as exciting for me. It was fine. And we weren't necessarily looking to sell either, but we had a upstream vendor come to us. They were a national distributor who tried to compete against us on the retail side, was not able to successfully do so. And then ultimately, I think, and these are always weird, but a competitor of ours took on PE money from TPG, and that caused kind of a cascade in our industry because they couldn't compete against our competitor. They ended up coming to us and we started acquisition discussions.
So after you sold Air Splat, you actually went and did something even harder, which is sell perishable inventory. Not only did you do that, but you basically were able to sell to GrubHub within 4 years instead of 15. So can you tell us about how you're able to speed up that business creating and building and selling process that you were able to learn from Air Splat or improve on?
Yeah. Great question. So interestingly enough, back in 2011, I actually started noticing grocery as kind of a category that I might be interested in as part of my discovery with kind of just looking across different ecosystems and sectors. Grocery at the time, 2011, I think was interesting because Walmart had decided to grocery, where originally they were not. I think it's pretty prevalent now across almost all the Walmarts, but originally they were doing dry goods or hard goods, but no grocery. So they moved in around 2012. CVS did it around 2013 in a test store, but I started noticing kind of movement in that vertical or in that sector. So in 2016, 2015-ish, 2016, it was right after I had a short break after Air Splat. Fortunately, I didn't get locked into, because I had mostly removed myself from operations. I wasn't locked into continued operations and the buyout. There was a short time, but most of it was pretty easily handled. So when I was looking, I felt timing wise, right around 2016 was about the right time in the evolution of kind of the industry to move online for this specific product category or category as it just in general to move online. So I felt like it was good timing, was ready to take a bet on it. I think go-to-market and kind of differentiator, this is kind of where my head was at. I felt like we shouldn't be competing against Walmart or Amazon had started doing Amazon Fresh back in I think around 14. So just a couple of years prior to us starting as well. So I was trying not to compete with them directly because I think anyone trying to go head to head with them would have a hard time. So our focus was really like an online farmers market, really focusing on niche, small batch, artisanal food. So we decided to focus on peripheral aisle products, which is kind of on the outskirts of around the peripheral of the supermarket where it's all refrigerated. We stayed away from the center aisle products, which was kind of all the soda, chips and cereals and flour and whatnot. We felt like there was one more margin there. A lot of this was feelings and based on research was kind of proving out, but ultimately until you actually executed and launched, you wouldn't know, but it actually all worked out. So 40% of a grocery, depending on which grocery store, but grocery stores revenues was less than half, right? Definitely a 40 to 20% driven by peripheral aisle products, but usually about 60 to 80% of their margin was derived from peripheral aisle. So we really wanted to focus on essentially high margin products that were cold chain sensitive as well as perishable, meaning timing sensitive as well. So it was, I felt, a good differentiator and a good value proposition for the consumers. So that's how we kind of launched and differentiated ourselves. It was an interesting bet, I think, and timing wise, I felt was great because in 2017, essentially the year and a half after we launched, Amazon acquired Whole Foods. It was a great validator for us in the space, being in the sector, but it was hard to raise funding because I think everyone was like, oh, Amazon moved into the space. We kind of need to do a wait and hold. Initially, I self-funded it with a couple of $1 million just to kind of get us off the ground. So timing wise was actually a little difficult, but we worked our way through it.
You sold right before COVID, right?
Yeah. So it's one of those things. It's a great question. One of those things it's just hardest to do in not just venture, but in any business is determine kind of these. I think timing is hard enough on its own, but these 100-year kind of events is just impossible to time. It was quite an experience. I think we were growing quite significantly. I think scaling and kind of going through the motions, I think I got much better at. That's why I think your earlier question, we were able to scale actually to relatively sizable, I guess, operation within a few years. But yeah, it's hard to time this. I think post-COVID, well, I sold before COVID, but I was still involved post-COVID because there was an earnout. I mean, it was insane. But it's interesting to see because you're part of a larger enterprise So the decisions and the focus they have is actually very different than a growing kind of startup. For us, it's pretty standard growth at all costs kind of mentality. But once you're part of a larger organization, it was not that at all. I think they had other competing interests and goals in mind. So once that happened, it was a very different beast and different organization. But yeah, correct. Right before COVID. I think a lot of our competitors post-COVID, I think during COVID had a fair amount of growth. Post-COVID was an adjustment. There was some consolidation. It was interesting to see how it played out.
So actually, I don't think Will and Andrew know this. I actually didn't share this with you guys before, but Kent, you must remember that's how we met was when you were fundraising for Milk and Eggs.
Yes.
And this is before FF, before we reconnected later in life. And I was working at Baidu Ventures at the time. And we were interested, from our perspective, it was more about automation, robotics, and how that could be integrated into the logistics side of things. And yeah, I just want to talk about, because I remember distinctly on the call, I think you seemed very fatigued. And I think we kind of glossed over going back to the airsoft company. And in our research, you shared about how there were times when you were just exhausted, right? The hours you're working and just, yeah, the mental fatigue. Can you talk a bit about some of the tough times? We're kind of like, oh, the business grew and it was so great. Tell us a little bit about when you were kind of like on your wits' end.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up, Lee. Anyone that has been through this will know starting a business is not easy. And then especially a venture-backed business. I think at the time we had raised, I self-seeded and then had post-raised our first round. So when I spoke to you, Lee, it was probably during our second fundraising. So I think it's definitely very taxing. Again, like first business, it was 14, 15-hour days, 7 days a week. I think probably not dissimilar to some of you guys, because I think some of you guys did investment banking. Probably pretty similar. But for Milk and Eggs in specific, it was a different kind of taxing due to a couple of different dynamics. One was it was venture backed. So that sort of growth, I think we got up to a couple of hundred people within, I think by the second year. So it was much faster. But operationally, It was different as well, because operationally, and this is pretty common around the world, but the produce industry or the perishable industry works graveyard. So essentially it's like midnight to 7 a.m. So my days were essentially, I would go into work around 11 p.m., work with them until about 4 a.m. That's when all the cars and drivers went out. I felt like operationally, we had a pretty unique business model, both the fact that it was asset light and inventory asset light. So essentially my whole goal at the time was everything light, right? Everyone was moving to the cloud. Everyone was starting to toy around with like Zoom and work from home. We were really kind of just slightly ahead of the bubble. It's amazing. These 100-year catastrophe will do to a kind of society. On the consumer facing end, our business model was just in time. So we would list everything on the website for sale. It was about 400 or 500 products, SKU count wise, all perishable, or most 90% perishable, but none of it was in stock. They would place an order, kind of the cutoff was about 6 p.m. We would then aggregate all the orders and then send them off to kind of the aggregators or the farmers. They would then deliver to us at midnight that night. And then we would, in our warehouse, we called it a sorting aggregation center. So everything would go in, get sorted into the orders, and then just go out at 4 a.m. Nothing was held in inventory. Asset light because we weren't having, or inventory light because of that. Asset light because we didn't have any of our own drivers. So on the back end, we also had a two-sided marketplace, which was essentially like an Uber, but it wasn't what we called point-to-point, because I'm so operation-centric and such a kind of huge believer of efficiency. I didn't believe in the one point-to-point or one point to one point kind of delivery model. GrubHub or DoorDash or Postmates, any of these kind of operators. I didn't feel like there was enough unit economics and efficiency in these kind of models. So we would give one driver, the way the marketplace would work is a driver would choose their end destination, meaning let's say west side or east side or down south. And then we would route 10 to 15 orders for them to drop off en route to their end destination. So the drivers loved it. We had a backlog of, I think at any point in time, we had about 50 to 70 drivers, and we had a backlog of probably 350 or so, 350 drivers ready to kind of come on board, mainly because they loved the fact that they're getting paid to go to where they needed to go. And it was a good supplemental income for them as well. It was really gig economy focused, right? Because the delivery hours were 4 to 8 a.m. So it was before they started work. And then the second delivery delivery window was on the way back. We were leveraging kind of the transit of people. So the second one was 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. So when they're finish work, ate dinner, and then was heading back home. So we would leverage that kind of move that transition in kind of general population in the workforce. So asset light, inventory light. So my hours, I would end at 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m. I think initially, again, sometimes we had drivers call out, or one driver calling out is not too big. We would reroute or even have backup drivers. But there were times definitely when there was multiple drivers that called out, flu season or whatnot, big rainstorm, different things you just can't account for. Throw everything in my car and I would make the deliveries myself. Pretty normal.
I was going to ask, like, did you have to throw on like a milk and eggs jacket and
Oh,
cap and just like head out,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
all hands on deck kind of thing?
Yeah. All hands. Yeah, definitely. That part was probably the hardest because it was so last minute, right? I think pick and pack takes several hours, so it's not a big deal. But once that 4 o'clock cutoff, when drivers are supposed to head out, it's a cutoff and that's it. If you don't make that window or cutoff, if you don't head out or drive out, you're not going to make your deliveries on time. That was a little more urgent. But there was times definitely, yeah, would then go make my deliveries. I'd still be home by 7 a.m. So would see the kids off to school and then go to sleep, wake up at 11, and then kind of start my day again. It was interesting. I ultimately ended up, and we can get into this later on with, I know one of the topics is biohacking and kind of just longevity and kind of health part. I ended up doing, a friend recommended it to me. It's called multiphasic sleep cycle. So you don't sleep in one batch or one lump sum at night. You break it up into different parts of the day. And I actually, again, this is all for business, right? So I ended up doing a biphasic sleep cycle. So I would go to sleep around 5 or 6 p.m., wake up at 10. So that was 5 hours. Then go to work at 11 p.m., get home right around like 4 or 5 a.m., go to sleep again for 4 hours, and then wake back up. It took about a week for me to adjust to that schedule. But once I was doing it, I really enjoyed it. You still got your 8 hours of sleep, but just in 2 chunks. And it worked out pretty well. But definitely still fatigued, as you probably remember on the call. But there were definitely days where you had an 8 a.m. meeting or a 9 a.m. meeting, and my whole schedule got thrown off and my sleep schedule got kind of thrown out to me.
It sounds like at this point, you basically had, from an operation standpoint, things pretty good on lock. I'd like to talk about after selling your company, Milk and Eggs, and getting recruited to Taiwan, or whether or not you went to Taiwan and then went to JustKitchen. Could you talk a little bit about going to Taiwan?
Yeah, sure. So after exiting in 2019, I think my father and my family had asked me, would this be a good opportunity kind of for you to transition back to Asia? I was really fortunate and I think very honored to be asked. We have a fair amount of kind of legacy enterprises here in Asia that are part of the family businesses. There's about a couple of dozen companies. Some are privately held, some are publicly traded. Because I was born and raised in the United States, I never kind of dabbled on that side of the ocean in our family businesses. But I think timing wise, they had noticed I had exited. They had brought it up, I think internally, and they had mentioned it. I felt pretty lucky and fortunate to get asked to kind of come back and start working on this process. So in 2019, I came back it was actually November. It was just pre-COVID. Came back to kind of just kind of do some diligence and kind of get an understanding of kind of what was here. And also part of to set up a base of operations here, right? Buy a home, buy a car, set up bank accounts and whatnot. So that was kind of my discovery process in 2019. In that process, while I was back, I came across the guys at JustKitchen who were kind of just starting to do business formation and get things going. I happened to have made an investment in them. And then after I had moved back in 2020, it was probably Q2 of 2020, JustKitchen had started taking off. They were doing great. Because of that, I joined the team to help scale. So then actually I had to go back to the family and say, committed a 2-year break to them and said, I'll be back in 2 years, but apologize for kind of the sabbatical, but needed a short break to kind of focus on a personal investment that I had made. So did that for 2 years. We went public in about a year, about 14, 15 months in North America. And then the maturity of 2 years was exactly last 1 year ago from now. So have been now transitioning into the family businesses for about a year.
Could you explain what JustKitchen is? And this is during COVID. And so you talked about it really blowing up. And could you just describe what scaling meant?
Yeah. So JustKitchen, we're a dark kitchen operator. So dark kitchen only or ghost kitchen only. So meaning food delivery, no physical actual restaurant for dine-in, only a kitchen. We improved our unit economics and kind of operating efficiency by putting 4 to 5 or 6 brands in a single kitchen. So we can have, on Uber Eats or any of these kind of delivery platforms, we can have 4 or 5 menus listed, but really in reality, 1 staff, 1 kitchen, 1 operation. So high unit economics and efficiency and a pretty diverse kind of product offering. So that's what we did. Scaling was pretty intense, I guess. We built out in a year. Yeah. By the end of 12 months, we were in 15 kitchens. Staff was about 100 and I don't remember exactly, maybe about 120 or so, 130. And then by the second year, we were at 30 locations. Again, this is right before I left. I'm still on the board, but not operational. So by the time we left, we were in 6 different countries, 30 something locations, and yeah, several hundred in staff as well. So that was, I think, fortunately, without the hours being a component like milk and eggs, and we had a great team. It was amazing. CTO, CMO, CEO were all very, very experienced entrepreneurs. We were all in our kind of middle-aged entrepreneurs. So this is not our kind of first time at it. So everything was actually amazing. It was an amazing experience and everyone was great at what they were doing. I think culture and the cultural change being in Asia is a little bit different, especially being sensitive to kind of the different cultures in each country. And even between here in Taiwan, North and South, it was something definitely to be aware of. It wasn't a huge factor, but it was definitely a larger factor than I would have normally been experienced to back in the US.
Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I'm a huge believer in culture in an organization and determining kind of it being a major determining factor of success versus failure. Again, having kind of grew up and being born and raised in the US, Asian culture is definitely very different than Eastern culture is very different than Western culture. And then you get into the nuanced differences between kind of different societies and different cultural differences between Eastern, both geographies and countries. I think people are motivated by different things. And there's the subtleties of communication, what you call high context and low context cultures, and how you communicate and what you say and how things are conveyed, and kind of how it's like that saying, I think Reid Hoffman had mentioned, it's like culture is like everywhere and you're just not aware of it. It's like fish saying, what's this water that we're in? It's very prevalent, but then at the same time, it's very hard to put a finger on. But definitely being aware of that while you scale and making sure that you're sensitive to the different dynamics of it across the different countries is, I don't want to say challenging, but it's definitely a different component of scaling in Asia.
So Ken, I want to stop you right there because you mentioned you'd gone back to potentially get more involved with the family business, but instead you said you wanted to oversee this investment you made, but it sounds like you just want to get back into a knife fight. After years of toiling and busting your ass, it's a very intense vertical, right? And so I just want to kind of dive into your mindset. Like, why did you decide to take on this opportunity?
Great question. Thanks for asking that. I think startups in general are kind of a personal passion of mine. I really enjoy rolling up my sleeves and going at it. I was really impressed with the team. It definitely wasn't something I decided lightly, in case you're wondering. It took me about a good 2 to 3 months, maybe even 4 months to kind of pull this trigger. But it was definitely, I think there's a multitude of factors that I took into consideration. But the team, the opportunity, I think there was a slight difference in the fact that it wasn't 0 to 1 and it was kind of more 1 to 10, which I really at kind of my stage in life really appreciate much more. I think the 0 to 1 is definitely, I think at my stage, a little more effort than I would appreciate. So I think all of it combined was just like, oh, I think this is a great opportunity. Initially, I actually had, when they had asked, I had turned them down because I really was not comfortable with going back to my family and asking for sabbatical. But I think my wife was very instrumental in kind of pushing me to really outside my comfort zone and say, go for it, and set a kind of time frame and kind of cut off for how much I would commit to this. Ultimately, I think my family was understanding, which I really appreciate as well. So I think it all worked out, but definitely wasn't easy during the process.
Yeah. Also, shout out to May, Kenneth's wife, because I don't think we talked about this, but she was with you every step of the way. She's your college sweetheart, right? You guys got married, had kids, you were twice an entrepreneur, and she was working with you, right? That must have been tough, raising kids early. How was it working as a husband-wife team? What was that dynamic like?
Oh, interesting. So our personalities are pretty contrasting in the fact that, so I'm definitely kind of leader of the pack, head of the spear, carve a path forward, big picture strategy, and then a little weaker on kind of some of the nuances and details. And definitely personality-wise, I mean, there's going back to this whole culture component. In all of my organizations, we do a fair amount of assessments to make sure there's a good cultural fit. And there's several dynamics and several assessments for this because there's different kind of facets that you can test for. So we internally tested a lot, always displayed everyone's results publicly, kind of full transparency, and made sure everyone could appreciate what everyone brought to the table. So we were very complementary, at least in that regard. So she was great at kind of execution, following someone's lead and carrying through. Whereas I was always good with testing and trial and iterating and kind of like bashing my head up against the wall in all different kind of ways. So that regard was great. For a more steady state enterprise or operation, the lines are very clear. Division of labor is very clear. And that worked very well for her. At Milk and Eggs, she was probably only there for about 6 to 9 months. Once we received an acquisition offer and we started entertaining and started this process, she immediately was like, wanted to transition out because she didn't want to get stuck with kind of being part of the earnout or being there for a long time. So, but definitely it's interesting. I think it's great if you know how to manage it. I know a handful of other husband and wife operations or partners, and it works out great as long as you have complementary skill sets and personalities and know where to draw the line, and business stays at business. And there's kind of this like firewall, church of the state of work is work and personal is personal. And you try not to kind of carry it across the two sides.
You've mentioned before that your grandfather was an inspiration to you. Could you talk a little bit about your grandfather?
Absolutely. So he was a very successful businessman in Taiwan during an era where Taiwan went through a period of great affluence and great growth. I remember being in middle age now. I remember being in, was it probably elementary school, where everyone was saying everything's made in Taiwan, MIT, right? So in the 80s and the 70s, it was a great growth period for Taiwan and specific out of Asia. And my grandfather was, I don't want to say significant, but definitely a major player in kind of growth. Did very well, did a bunch of different businesses across multiple verticals and sectors and industries, from concrete for raw material to textiles. There's a handful of textiles companies, both from raw material to taking raw material and making it into a raw fabric for, like, let's say a clothing manufacturer, to food manufacturing, distribution, real estate development, property management, all sorts of different verticals. And it was amazing to see him do all of this in essentially one lifetime. But definitely, I think at the end of it, by the time he passed away, I think he was probably one of the top 5 families in Taiwan. So an amazing accomplishment during an amazing opportunity and era of Taiwan history.
So I'm glad you brought this up, Kent, because I've kind of heard from other people kind of about your background, your family. I was telling you, like, that's actually what I respect a lot about you, is that in a sense, you could say successful grandfather, father, etc. You had kind of like backup plan if things didn't go well. You didn't have to work that hard. But having known you for like 5-6 years now, I mean, you give it your all to everything you do. And we'll get into like why you have a six pack as well. But going back to just like the tenacity and the drive that you have, where do you get that from? What do you think drives you?
I don't know if I've given this much thought in specific, but yeah, no, I think if I can maybe just unpack this, kind of think out loud. So my grandfather's done amazing. I think what he accomplished in a lifetime was definitely inspirational and something to look up to. We as a family, kind of internal culture or dynamic, was always very frugal and very cost conscious. So I think for me, being kind of born and raised in the US, never actually really saw much of or had much exposure to the affluence and kind of the progress that we had made. In addition to that, I think the family dynamic is, and kind of the unwritten rule is philanthropy. So I think when he passed, he donated a majority of his wealth and assets to charity. And I think my father said the same thing too. His motto was, you're not going to get anything, so don't sit on your laurels and think you're going to get anything from us. In my generation, it's true. I think we have about 60 cousins or so. And amongst all of us, we don't necessarily have the mentality of that we're going to kind of sit back and get anything. So I think most of my cousins, at least in the US, have all kind of developed their own career path, right? Whether it be lawyers and dentists and pretty stereotypical Asian professions, but yeah, dentists and chiropractors and doctors and whatnot. And they're all very successful in their own right. So it's unfortunate because what happens is you don't develop this kind of pedigree to kind of come back into the business and the family enterprises. So you kind of have this pro and con of kind of this mentality. But yeah, I think generally amongst my uncles and aunts, it's also the same mentality that a majority of the inheritance will be handed off to nonprofit and philanthropy.
So you were asked to come back to Taiwan to help with your family businesses. And after leaving JustKitchen, or at least operationally leaving JustKitchen, you're now sitting on a handful of boards. Could you just talk a little bit about what those roles are like and what companies those are for?
Yeah, no, sure. It's definitely a transition because right now, I think through my career path from kind of bottoms up 0 to 1 and then 1 to 10, putting on my board hat now and kind of really honing my skill set and kind of value creation from top down, it's something I'm very excited about and eager about. eager to explore and develop. A lot of these enterprises and businesses have been around for some as short as 30 years, some as long as 80, 90 years. So these are very developed, very mature legacy businesses. And navigating through that and figuring out who the decision makers are, who the key players are, the stakeholders are, it's definitely a different skill set and a different kind of vantage point. I'm really hoping to take this opportunity and do something that normally I think is pretty rare for kind of a founder operator to kind of be able to step into. I'm optimistic. I have a couple of things that I'm working on, but I'm optimistic that this will be a skill set that I will carry on for kind of the second stage of my career.
I mean, it's a wide variety of types of businesses, right? Can you just go into those, either the category or just what these businesses do?
A couple of dozen businesses that our families are involved in, but the ones that I'm on the board for, one's auto retail, auto manufacturing, food manufacturing. There's a family office component of one of the businesses. There's a textiles one as well. Real estate development. I think that's it. Let me see if I'm missing any other ones. I think that's mostly it. There might be one I'm missing, but definitely different kind of stage and a different kind of operation. And again, especially on this level from the board down, culturally, these are completely different beasts from kind of startup space. I think the difference and the contrasting perspective, both in age and size of these organizations compared to what I'm used to, is a great learning experience and a very interesting experience.
What's been some big differences you've seen for kind of exerting influence on the boards versus at your previous companies?
Andrew, great question. This is very unique. I think two simplest ways to describe this is probably has to do with candor as well as context. So like Japanese companies are very high context, right? So really it's not about what I say, it's about how I say it, right? And potentially even some of the words I use to, so some of what I say, right? But highly dependent on kind of reading the room and kind of what's being said and how it's being said and kind of all those different factors. So in Western boards, the kind of all the ones I've been on, it's a very high candor, high discussion, kind of really there to explore and have dialogue and discussion. On Eastern style boards, quite the opposite, actually. So there's very little discussion. Everything is decided mostly beforehand. Very rarely is there a time where there's kind of dissent or dialogue that kind of transpires. Most of it is pre-discussed. So there's a lot of kind of offline communication prior to meeting. And again, it's high context, meaning very subtle communication cues. So I consider myself a Westerner. It's kind of weird, but kind of a Westerner stepping into this, it's definitely something to be very, very conscious and sensitive to. It's very easy to kind of overstate something, and for you not even to realize it and not even get the feedback that you overstepped. So it's actually great because I think having spent so much time in the US, you're very used to this kind of dialogue. And I think it's great. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's a whole different experience and different, I hate to say it again, but skill set to be able to navigate these nuanced kind of highly contextual discussions and environments. It's something I actually, believe it or not, didn't have much opportunity to practice in kind of Western organizations. It's interesting and intriguing game to play right now. So it's great.
Was this something that you kind of had inside you that you just had to develop over time? Or was it something that you went into it and didn't really realize that this was going on and you had to learn on your own? Was it something that like you had to learn, like basically someone was teaching you, or did you figure it out by yourself? Like, how did you come across this?
Unfortunately, it's a little bit of trial and error and a little bit of being kind of just like socially aware and mindful of what was kind of happening around nature versus nurture, right? By nature, I'm very direct. I think by nurture, at least in the Western, kind of the US startups I was, and kind of both with staff and management, the nuanced and highly contextual communication was kind of just went over most people's heads. I learned to speak with more candor and candidness. So learning this kind of subtlety and nuanced communication was actually a muscle that I hadn't exercised and flexed in a long time. So it's great, I think, to be able to be in this position. And I have many friends that are actually multicultural and kind of multi-background. And it's amazing to watch them kind of navigate and switch between both sides, depending on kind of setting and environment and kind of who they're in and engaging with, and watching them switch from subtlety to kind of directness and going back and forth. So I think for me, at least, I'm very eager and interested in seeing how this kind of muscle develops and how I'm able to build on this.
I have one more. Let's see if on the board piece, actually. So
Yeah.
Have you found that the goals for success for you are the same across East and West? And what are those high level goals and where are there differences, if any, between East and West boards, given your role?
I think it's pretty consistent for the most part. If you were to zoom out to about 10,000 feet, high level, it seems everyone's there for the most part for the benefit of the business. Value creation, want to make sure the organization is doing well, see where they can add value and help. So I think in that regard, it's actually all pretty similar. I think how they go about executing it is a little bit unique. Even for JustKitchen, like I'm on the board for JustKitchen as well. And that's actually pretty interesting too, because I think half of the board is composed of people from North America. And then there's two operational people that I think are somewhat Eastern in their kind of mentality. So that's an interesting blend as well. It's again, I think especially as for me at least, right, as I develop into kind of this next stage of my career and go into potentially multinational kind of endeavors, being sensitive to these nuances is actually a great skill set and an advantage to have. So I'm enjoying this transition into the next stage.
All right. So I want to get into something that I'm very excited about. A couple months ago, you posted your before and after photo of basically 5 years ago to now. And you are probably one of the buffest people that I know. And then you did this in your 40s too, right? And so
With the
I wanted
exception
to talk
to you, of course, right?
I wanted to talk about how did you start getting into fitness?
Sure. So I think health over fitness is definitely a passion of mine. As a caveat, before I get into like kind of, and based on your previous podcast, we get kind of do deep dives into a lot of the stuff. And if we do get into like really deep stuff like biohacking, I do want to caveat this topic with the fact that I'm a firm believer and a firm proponent of kind of keeping it simple and incrementalism or incremental improvements. I think a lot of people, when they start on their health journey, get overwhelmed with kind of just like all the stuff out there. And I think even in the last 10 years, I think it's just the amount of research and kind of data information, both because of the internet and how readily available it is, coupled with the fact that there's just so much more research and emphasis on this kind of topic that it's very easy for anyone to get totally overwhelmed. And I think in our group chat that we have, always a proponent of just like keep it simple, just start simple and not to scare off people. But anyways, I think for me, I've actually followed that approach as well. I think prior to 5 years ago, my health regimen and routine was actually relatively simple, partially because I was operational and very tactical. My time allocation to health was bare bones. So I was anti-gym. The only time I had worked out prior to recently with this last 5-year segment was in college. Worked out in college for about a year or so. I felt like I bulked up pretty good. I'm still lighter then than I was now. I don't know my body composition, percentage body fat, because I think back literally 25 years ago, doing these body scans and kind of regardless of whether it be DEXA scan or in body or just body composition scans were not as common. So I think generally was then worked out. There was a school gym, was very easily accessible and made it very easy to do. And kind of, I think similar to your journey, Will, was about just like bulk up, be big. And that was about it. Post that, I essentially never, for 21 years, never entered a gym again. And it was always about functional fitness and just working out and exercising, whether it be taking the stairs to work or home, walking more, playing tennis, taking the kids for a bike ride, and really just kind of doing outdoorsy, easily accessible exercise. And really, it's actually not 5 years because I joined a gym when I moved back to Asia because my impression was that, okay, Asian city structure is hard to do outdoor activity. So I think gave in and I want to say relegated myself to, okay, I'm going to do gym workouts now. So I joined a gym in 2020. So it's actually been about 3 years. But health consciousness and health activities, essentially a whole lifetime.
So you mentioned biohacking. Can you talk about what you were doing for biohacking?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of people get into this pretty deep and do all sorts of different things. Again, caveat, I think for anyone listening, it's whatever works for you and everyone's biology is different. So I think before getting into this, I think as long as you have a mindset of like, I want to discover and trial and error and test what works best for each person. So for me, I started intermittent fasting probably about 8 years ago. I have, unfortunately, a genetic predisposition for diabetes. So I've been pre-diabetic for probably since I was 30. So for 17 years now. So I've been doing finger pricks, testing my blood glucose, fasting glucose levels for 17 years now. Last couple of years with the invention of the CGM, continuous glucose monitor, I've been using that on and off. Have done some experimenting with metformin as well as a bunch of supplements. I think my supplement regimen is probably about 20 something pills in the morning.
We got to talk about that. It's kind of crazy.
There's a photo that you sent that I should share with everyone because like it's amazing how many.
It's like a pharmacy, dude.
Yeah. A lot of these supplements are kind of some potential gain. I mean, none of these are like, I think you guys mentioned in a previous podcast, they're not regulated. So it's a little tricky. So there's some potential downside, but it's nominal. And quite honestly, on the upside, I can tell you with all these supplements, I think a majority of them, I don't notice much difference. My mentality is there's not much to lose. So I might as well just keep adding on to it. So, but in the mornings, every morning I have about 21 pills I take. After lunch, there's about 6 pills I take. And then at night, there's 12 pills I take. And some of them kind of phase in and phase out. It's all about incrementalism and slowly adding on to this. I think 5 years ago, I was probably only taking 6 or 7 pills. We got off on a tangent.
No, keep going.
Intermittent fasting for about 8 years. I think the supplements can fall under biohacking as well. So again, my biology with intermittent fasting, I kind of being at this point somewhat still pre-diabetic, but kind of diabetic. I don't get low energy levels in the morning. So my glycogen levels, triglycerides, and cholesterol levels are relatively high. So my energy reserves so I've never had energy issues. And then of course, on the training side, I think you guys have mentioned the health pyramid or fitness pyramid. I think during different phases of my kind of regimen and stages of my life, there's been different emphasis on the strength versus the endurance versus the functional or mobility. I think it's an evolution for everyone, and whatever stage you're in depends on kind of what you're doing. Will, I think you're a pretty big proponent of really developing strength and growing. For me, on my strength training, I really try not to push it too hard. Recovery, as well as both from a single day workout as well as from injury, is definitely not what it once was. But having said that, there are definitely times I train to failure quite often, but just in different methodology as opposed to maxing out. I try actually not to do PRs. I actually very rarely do PRs or personal records, but it definitely get to failure in different ways. And then morning pills, believe it or not, my supplement regimen, majority of it is actually based on longevity. I want to say about 75% of the pills or supplements or some sort of study at some point in time had said that increases lifespan and whatnot, including metformin. I can get into kind of this GLP-1s and metformin kind of journey that I've had as well. But happy to dive into any part of this that you guys are interested in.
Hold on. So you're saying that's you now, right? But then when you first started working out, because that photo, we should share that photo. You know, it was like just like a kind of normal, I don't want to say like skinny, but you were not jacked, right? You went from like a normal person to like jacked. What was the mentality then? Was it see as far as you can go, like push yourself? What was kind of like the thought process?
Lee, thanks for asking that, because I think both for the benefit of the listeners, I think it's important to kind of understand the journey. And thank you for the compliment. I actually don't consider myself jacked, but thanks.
You are, bro.
I think 2019, so about 4 years ago, weight was probably around a little bit lighter than I was now. Body composition wise, I was probably around 19, 20% body fat. And right now I'm hovering around 13, 14 pretty comfortably. I still love my pizzas and my pastas and kind of all my, I don't want to say
dude,
junk
and your
food.
desserts.
Oh, my
You love
desserts. Yes,
dessert.
correct. So I reserve, thanks for bringing that up, Lee. I reserve all of my carb intake to desserts. That's my guilty pleasure. So I essentially have cut out all carbs, whether it be rice or noodles or breads or whatnot, to exclusively just desserts. I will have that guilty pleasure a couple of times a week, probably, always post meal, so it doesn't spike my glucose. And I think different to you, Will, I take an approach of sustainability. So instead of kind of these, I have to hack it, I have to take this very hardcore approach because I can't walk that line of moderation. I actually really thrive in that kind of environment. For example, like if I really crave sugar or sweet, I can open a can of ice cream and limit myself to 4 bites. Like I will do 4 bites.
Wow.
Yeah. And then be done. Like my sugar craving is resolved and then put away the ice cream.
Wow.
Same thing for chips. Unfortunately, I know, Lee, you have a mentality of don't have the junk food at home, but we have 2 young kids at home and 2 younger kids. One's a teenager and one's relatively younger. So they have a lot of snacks. We generally have a lot of snacks at home. They really enjoy it. So does May. So every time I open that cupboard, it's like Frosted Flakes look so good. Can you believe that? Frosted Flakes, right? And every time I have to turn myself, it's a good way of building discipline. But Doritos and Frosted Flakes and Cheetos and pretzels are all plentiful. So there's hacks, right? When you take it out, you put it in the bowl, you know how much you're going to eat. and you commit to that amount, right? As opposed to you taking the bag out. Anytime I take the bag out, don't get me wrong, I will eat the whole bag like it's done. So the goal is take it out, put it in a bowl. It's very specific. You can see how much you're eating. And then once you're finishing that bowl, you're done.
You just have the discipline, I think, comes down. I don't have that. I just can't have it at home.
Don't get me wrong, it's hard. I mean, discipline is one of those things that it's a muscle that you have to train as well. It's definitely hard. But anyway, sorry. Desserts, definitely a weak point for me. And I would indulge a couple of times a week, but generally I try to stay away from it. And again, with my CGM, when I overindulge out of necessity, I very quickly notice my glucose levels rising. So it's very normal. But again, lead back to your topic. I wouldn't consider myself jacked by any means. I think right now I'm probably heaviest I've been in my life. I think back in college, I was probably about 5 pounds lighter, but percentage body fat probably maybe slightly lower as well. So just to give context. So right now I'm 6 feet, 182 centimeters, right? 80 kilograms or 177 pounds. And again, percentage body fat about 14%. And I'm pretty comfortable with this level. I've dropped down to probably like 11, 12, and it's very hard for me to sustain at that level. Because again, you just
can't eat those desserts, man.
Yeah, you
when
can't.
your body fat's that
Well, I mean,
low.
not even desserts, right? I can't have my pizza, right? I love pizza. I love hamburgers, right? I mean, I can't do that at all, right? I can't drink at all, can't socialize, right? So it gets very difficult to sustain at that level. I mean, I think it takes from 13% to drop down to 9% probably takes 3 or 4 months. And then to sustain at that level, I mean, it's just indefinite, right? So I think quality of life diminishes quite significantly, and it's just not worth it for me. I really just enjoy life too much, right? Both the socializing, the drinking, the eating, these are all joys of life, right? I think my son says this all the time. He says, the only reason you work out, Dad, is so that you can eat. And I 100% agree with him. Absolutely. Yeah.
You've mentioned before that building muscle in your 40s is different from when you were younger. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. So I think, again, stage of life is you can't fight kind of biology and aging. So I think mentality-wise, it's very important to make sure we're kind of true to ourselves and consistent with kind of where we are in our stage of life, right? So for me, and kind of touching back on Lee's question, when I started this journey, at least at the gym 4 years ago, I started with just working out with the bar and just making sure form was correct and just kind of really just, and again, it's all incremental, right? My mentality when I first started working out was, instead of what I call Netflix and chill, what people call Netflix and chill, I did Netflix and gym. And this was from a friend who he did this amazing journey where he started doing cycling. This was in 2016 or 17. And he would do an hour and a half cycling every day. And he would watch a horror flick for the hour. And every day he would watch a horror flick. So he would go through a horror flick every day and do his cycle ride for an hour. And as a caveat, just to anyone out there that's trying to lose weight and whatnot, I think, again, regardless of what you're trying to do, whether it be cycling, CrossFit, kind of strength training, whatever the case may be, I think what most people just don't realize, and I just suggested this to a friend and he's been having great progress with this, fat metabolism happens in zone 2, right? So easiest way to do that is just incline walk, right? Go to the gym, or you just do this outside, right? It's just walking up a hill, right? You get to zone 2, you can burn your fat. You do this for 20 minutes a day, and it's cardiovascularly, it's healthy, as well as burning fat. It's great, right? And I think that's a great starting point for anyone trying to start this journey, because you don't want to be weight training with all this excess baggage of weight that normally really you shouldn't be carrying around or should not be adding to your weight load. So do that. I think that's the easiest thing to do. It's what I did prior to this journey. Prior to 2019 was just anything and everything outside of the gym. But for me right now, when I started, it was about kind of, okay, let me just start, see where it goes. I did this, again, Netflix and gym kind of thing. So I would go to the gym for 45 minutes, an hour, watch a show, and it was my guilty pleasure, right? Whether or not how much I worked out was kind of irrelevant. And again, that's 4 years ago. Now it's much different. Generally, I do about a 20-minute warm up, incline walk, stretching, because at my age, mobility, strength, and endurance are all components that I'm trying to work on. So we'll do stretching, some functional fitness and stretching, watch a little bit of TV, or Netflix while I'm working on that. Then we'll do about 45 minutes to an hour of strength training, 3 to 4 times a week. And then twice a week, I started playing tennis again as well to work on my endurance. I think that's something recent as well. So it's very holistic. I think in your 40s, I don't push the weights too much. Although now I think 4 years into this journey, it definitely has increased quite significantly. I think the last year of this 4-year journey has been on weight gain, like lean mass gain. I think prior to that, it was just about being healthy. So now I think earlier this year, I got up to 82 kilograms, so about 180 something pounds. I think the comments from both my mother and my sister and my family were that you're too bulky. So I started leaning down a little bit in the last maybe 6 months or so.
It's tough being Asian, man. It's tough being Asian.
That essentially is it. So again, I think whatever fits for everyone, don't overemphasize this. I think really health is the most important thing. I think 5 or 6 years ago, there's this big thing about the 7-minute workout. I think that's great too. I mean, by all means, whatever works for you, right? So I think people constantly overcomplicate it, right? If we're talking about longevity, quality of life, keep it simple. Don't overindulge. Don't make it more difficult than you need to make it, right? And I think same thing, I concur and probably follow the same habits as you. Sometimes I go to the gym and it's tough, right? Like I didn't sleep well. I had a meeting. I don't have enough time. There's all sorts of excuses, but I just show up. In one of our earlier podcasts, you mentioned Atomic Habits as a book, but I hate to crash on the party, but they had a post study after that saying, revealed that it was totally fraudulent data and they had falsified the data, but I still believe in it, right? So I'll show up to the gym, even if it's for 45 minutes, 30 minutes, I'll do my thing. Even if I can't go to the gym, I'll commit 20 minutes to like climbing the stairs at home or just doing sit-ups and push-ups, right? Or I can't do it with my daughter who's in her teenage years now, but with my son who's a little bit younger, it's a very common practice to say, help me exercise, and he'll jump on my back while I do push-ups, and he'll jump on my back while I do squats and whatnot. And it's fun for him, enjoys kind of being the extra baggage and weight. And then at the same time, understand and appreciate kind of just health and being just working out and being.
You've had quite an incredible entrepreneurial journey, starting from Air Splat, where you were the only person working at the company, all the way till now, where you're sitting on multiple boards that are public corporations that have been around for 50, 60 years. What advice do you have for other entrepreneurs?
Great question. I would probably start with, I think it's similar to my suggestion for the health journey. Start simple, but more than that, probably one layer deeper is focus on your why. What drives you? What motivates you? Because ultimately, I think if you are successful, ultimately accomplish success, it'll be because you didn't consider it work and you enjoy the endeavor as well as the process. I think regardless of how much I worked, how trying and taxing it was, I think I still enjoyed a lot of it, right? So, I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes it's a pain in the butt to wake up and being tired sucks. But in the long run, if you do what you really appreciate and enjoy and what really drives you and motivates you, it is much, much easier to do.
What's next for you?
I think right now, my goal is to finalize the transition into these board level positions, really kind of navigating my way through and really getting a better grasp of the decision makers, the stakeholders, and having a good impact and good influence and value creation for these enterprises. That would be what I call stage 2.1. I plan on 2.5, which is starting something more impactful and having more philanthropic roots in stage 2.5.
Basically, walking your grandfather's footsteps. Sounds like.
Oh, great suggestion, but I don't think I will have that significant of an impact. I think it's a great inspiration and some great steps to follow in, but I don't know if I'll ever get there, but appreciate the analog.
So final question, where can people find you?
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn. I unfortunately am not on Twitter. I'm on Instagram, so it can be found on Instagram. On Instagram, it's Kent Wooster. On LinkedIn, I believe it's under Kenneth Wu. But I think if you look up any of the companies, you'll be able to find my profile on the companies as well.
All right. Thanks so much for your time, Kent. Really enjoyed the interview.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening until the end. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It'll help more people like you find us. You can find more about us on wild.show, wld.show. Please subscribe to our newsletter or DM us on Twitter. We'd love to get to know you.